First, as you can see from my bio, I believe, I am a combat Vietnam veteran, having served as a Navy corpsman with elements of the 3rd Marine Division, 1966 through 1968, at different times because of my injuries. I then moved from there to deal with my own mental illness, if you will, PTSD. I completely submerged myself in academia. I'm a recovering academic, as a matter of fact. My last position was director of the center that dealt primarily with domestic violence and high-risk sexual behaviors. So I have an interest in the subject that we're talking about. For the last decade, I've been serving as the chair of the National PTSD and Substance Abuse Committee for Vietnam Veterans of America, and just recently, 2 months ago, accepted a full-time position with VBA here in Washington. Our offices are over in Silver Spring, and moved here. So I'm still haven't unpacked, but I can find my way around the city pretty well on the metro. And just one other comment: as a recovering academic, I have way too many books that I've been hauling around. So with that background, on behalf of Vietnam Veterans of America, I'm proud to be here today, and I'd like to thank Witness Justice and the Veterans Initiative Center and Research Institute for providing me the opportunity to participate in today's briefing on veterans, combat stress, and the family. I should like to say right at the beginning, if any of the things that I say bother you, feel free to get up, walk out, get a drink of water. For those of you who are still addicted, have a smoke downstairs. But I'm going to be pretty frank about some things, and wherever possible, I will use my own experience as a self-disclosure to illustrate points. We'll always have Paris. That's what Humphrey Bogart said as he parted from Ingrid Bergman in the film Casablanca. It's a great movie line, and it says a lot about the amazing human gift called memory. Like Bogey, you can keep your favorite places and people with you simply by pulling up your happy memories with them, even if they're miles away or long gone. Without flipping open a scrapbook, putting on a CD, you can conjure up your newborn's first smile, first few words, the ecstasy or the agony of prom night, or even the aroma of Mom's freshly baked cookies. But memories have a dark side also. They can make you feel devastated, furious, or humiliated. Did that make you think of your prom night again? Even decades after something bad happened. What's more, bad memories seem to stick more than happy ones. And that's especially true for the terrible memories like the ones our combat veterans have. While many of us are well aware of the prevalence of combat stress amongst our Vietnam veterans and our returning OIF, OEF vets, it's my sincere hope that you'll leave today's briefing with a better understanding of the impact of combat stress and the reintegration for our returning troops, how this affects families, and how it potentially can lead to family violence. First, however, a very brief history of combat stress, or what we now know today as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It's a very old malady. Dr. Jonathan Shea, who I'm proud to say is a colleague and a friend, traces PTSD back to the first written accounts of PTSD back to Homer's Iliad. It's a very old malady, as I said, and such has been called a variety of names. In the 1670s, Swiss military doctors described the symptoms as nostalgia. During the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, battlefield surgeons began calling it exhaustion. And by the time of the American Civil War, it had become known as soldier's heart and the effort symptom. I don't know how many of you know this bit of trivia. The reason we have veterans' homes in this country is because after the Civil War, there were thousands of veterans from both sides roaming the country. So we set up these institutions for them because the people didn't know what was going on with them. Shell shock became the term commonly used in World War I. And this was succeeded by combat fatigue and battle fatigue in World War II. So by the time the war in Vietnam was winding down in the early 70s, the term post-Vietnam syndrome was being used to describe veterans' traumatic stress reactions during and after their service in Southeast Asia. Finally, in 1980, the term post-traumatic stress disorder appeared in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, what we call the DSM-3. It's now the DSM-4. And it's still being used today. Now, PTSD has a lot in common with a normal stress reaction. The big difference is that it's a much more powerful response, and it doesn't go away. PTSD also looks like acute stress disorder. In fact, acute stress disorder becomes PTSD, diagnostically speaking, if symptoms last more than a month, generally speaking. Now, every medical disorder has its own signature, a pattern of symptoms that allow physicians to make a diagnosis and plan a treatment approach. In the case of PTSD, doctors look for three main types of symptoms. Number one, re-experiencing the traumatic event or events, which includes intrusive, distressing recollections of the past event, flashbacks, nightmares, and exaggerated emotional and sometimes physical reactions to triggers that remind the person of the event or events. Number two, avoidance or emotional numbing, which includes avoidance of activities, places, thoughts, feelings, or conversations related to the trauma, and restricting your emotions. The third element in that cluster of symptoms is increased arousal, as indicated by difficulty in sleeping, irritability or anger outbursts, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, and an exaggerated startle response. Normally, you can brush aside an unpleasant thought. If you have PTSD, however, your thoughts and emotions force their way into your mind, leaving you completely at their mercy. So the intrusive thoughts that appear or occur in PTSD almost always cause a very, very strong surge of emotion. Anger, fear, humiliation, helplessness, because the stress response is a total mobilization of your body's physical resources. Powerful neurochemicals flood your brain and body, including epinephrine, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, and endogenous opiates, and of course benzodiazepines. Sugars are also mobilized from liver and muscle. The respiratory rate is increased, as is the heart rate and blood pressure, and the immune system is activated. People wonder why Vietnam vets, after 40 years, coming down with all this other stuff. They've been operating, for those who have been operating under the conditions of acute PTSD, their immune system has been in high order for 40 years. And it takes its toll. When you're asleep, the intrusive thoughts show up as nightmares. During the daytime, they pull you away from present time, sometimes making you behave in ways that don't make sense to the people around you. The best known types of these daytime intrusions, although not everyone with PTSD experiences them, is called a flashback. Now, a flashback is a memory from your trauma that intrudes into the here and now, making you feel like you're right back there in the past. Flashbacks typically contain random bits and pieces of information, a sound, an odor, the color of a bystander's umbrella when you're riding the metro, rather than a full-fledged memory. That's one reason why it's extremely difficult to make sense of these blasts from the past or gain control over them without help from a therapist. Flashbacks usually involve sights and sounds, as when a veteran sees and hears sounds of a long-ago battle. But as I said, they can also include smells, tastes, or sensations of touch. Sometimes a flashback just won't go away. I love barbecue. Do not invite me to your pig roast, because I was in places where I smelt napalm and burning flesh. Not all intrusive thoughts, however, involve sensory flashbacks. Often people with PTSD have other negative thoughts, such as, people are out to get me, or nothing goes right for me, and that stems from their trauma. If you have PTSD, other people around you may mistakenly believe that a flashback or other intrusive thought is all in your head. What they don't understand is that in reality, your whole body, not just your mind, gets in the game. That's because you're not just thinking about the past, you are reliving it again. So after a trauma, you desperately want these terrible feelings to go away. But when PTSD strikes, unpleasant emotions just don't pack up and leave. In fact, they grow even stronger over time if they're not dealt with. And they can cause you intense distress. In order to cope, your mind tries to block or avoid these bad feelings with the intention of protecting you from the hurt. It's a natural response. These mind games, however, lead you to change your behaviors in different ways. For example, you may avoid activities associated with the trauma. If your trauma occurred in a moving convoy in Iraq, when you return home, you may drive faster without regard for other vehicles or the traffic laws applicable in the town where you're driving. You may block out key parts of the trauma, and this blocking is called psychogenic amnesia. You may avoid movies or TV shows for fear of seeing scenes that remind you of your trauma. I never went to see Apocalypse Now till it came out on video. I was afraid to see those scenes, even though it was a Hollywood movie. You may find it hard to fall asleep because you worry that nightmares will dredge up the fears that you've been trying to suppress. And of course, when you're awake, all you want to do is sleep as a means of escape from the daytime thoughts that plague you. So you're caught in a real catch-22. A related problem that occurs with PTSD is called emotional anesthesia. It's a different trick your mind uses to help you avoid pain. It works to some degree, but it also makes feeling the emotions you want to feel more difficult. For example, people who viewed themselves as outgoing, fun, warm, and loving before a traumatic event often say that they now have troubles feeling an emotional attachment to others or reacting in a normal way to others or to life's events. It hurts relationships. You may find sexual relations and intimacy unpleasant, simply boring. You may find that it steals the joy in your life. You may lose interest in hobbies and recreational activities, for example, that you formerly enjoyed. And emotional anesthesia can also make it harder for you to conjure up the emotions or enthusiasm you need to envision your future. The fancy term for this in the psychiatric world is called foreshortening. And that means that you have difficulty planning ahead and picturing where you'll be in the future. Sometimes you lose interest in your personal health, perhaps developing nutritional and substance abuse disorders. The last hallmark of PTSD that I want to mention today is hyperarousal, or when the nervous system stays on red alert all the time and you can't let your guard down. This situation causes a range of problems that affects relationships with other people and their general overall well-being. It includes chronic irritability, difficulty sleeping, and other physical reactions triggered by a fight, flight, or freeze response whenever a PSD trigger occurs, and quickness to anger, which I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. All this I'll call, as Dr. Matt Friedman from the National Center calls it, getting on the ride of the adrenaline train. Now, anger is one of the most common problems that troops encounter after deployment to the battlefield. This emotion, which stems from the high level of arousal and aggression needed for survival during war, can make reestablishing connections with your family and friends a difficult challenge because military training teaches us the use of feelings and emotion for the most rudimentary of purposes, namely differentiation between safe and dangerous situations. Skills required for distinguishing emotional nuances and exploring emotions within interpersonal relationships are not taught in the military. The military's mission requires training our service members to go into dangerous situations, effectively assess the level of danger within the situation, and to neutralize that danger using whatever force is necessary, regardless of how you personally feel about the situation. Combat missions are inherently aggressive, and that aggression is reinforced each time a service member is placed in harm's way. Combat veterans have been taught to use aggressive tactics to maneuver safely through the issues and problems they encounter on the battlefield. And when you add the component of learning how to disconnect from emotions, combat survival skills are nearly useless in creating an emotionally fulfilling relationship in civilian life. So there are lots of reasons a combat veteran feels angry. First, anger is really easy to tap into, so it's readily accessible at a moment's notice. It's often used to mask underlying feelings that are much more difficult to deal with, such as sadness, depression, or guilt. I have a lot of guilt because I was a Navy corpsman. Post-deployment anger can also stem from discouragement or frustration that the vet felt during deployment or even during reintegration. Following the rules is extremely critical when you're in the war zone. And you can become angry if those around you aren't following the rules or doing what they're not supposed to be, or doing what they're not supposed to be doing when you come home. This can even start during deployment because while in battle, problems become amplified. This means any fault you find in your comrades or superiors before or during deployment becomes more obvious during critical situations, just as at the moments when you believe a person in civilian life needs to perform better or at a higher level. Thus, you come to believe that others are not performing their jobs in the way they should. And the same anger carries over upon transition, manifesting itself with family and friends, maybe some others in the community. For example, you can get real angry over minor traffic situations or getting cut out of line at the movies. And because you feel like others aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, you may try and take over being controlling. And that has serious consequences in personal relationships and with children in particular. Anger can also be easily displaced onto the wrong person or into the wrong situation. Anger can also be related to issues of trust and betrayal. When service members return from war, they often realize that they're exasperated with the way life works, with the government, with military systems. They're furious about being dragged into a war when war was unexpected in their life, particularly true among some of our Guards people. They may feel angry with their higher power. And anger can be a response to being victimized and can also be directed toward a perpetrator of violence, such as an enemy combatant or a perpetrator of military sexual violence. Lastly, anger and irritability can be associated with the fear or loss of control felt at times during deployment. In times of extreme stress, terror, or life-threatening situations, such fear may be expressed as fight, flight, or freeze responses. Anger can motivate you. It can protect your feelings of self-esteem or make you feel in control. You may feel angry from discouragement or frustration over leaving a job unfinished, such as leaving your comrades in Baghdad or Kabul, or even at the injustices of the world over which you have absolutely no control. So in conclusion, our complex brains and powerful memories distinguish us as one of the most intelligent of animals on this planet. And yet it's this very intelligence that leaves us vulnerable to the intrusive effects of trauma, such as flashbacks, body memories, post-traumatic nightmares, and behavioral reenactments. Exposure to trauma alters people's memories in a number of ways, producing extremes of remembering too much and recalling too little. In my opinion, barriers exist to recognizing the full impact of trauma. The reality of traumatic amnesia in individual trauma survivors has repeatedly, in my opinion, left our culture with a cultural amnesia, especially when the trauma has occurred within marginalized groups such as veterans. In other words, there's a reluctance of both the survivors to dredge up the memories of the trauma, as well as a reluctance on the part of the larger audience to listen to the stories. As a result, it's been real easy for both survivors and the public to lose the thread of the cause and effect relationships inherent in trauma. It's time to look seriously at how the impact of trauma can play in the role of responses, and those responses which can place the family in a situation that's not safe, and sometimes one that's often seen in the light of domestic violence. So thank you, and afterwards I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.